Well, we're going to be in Acts chapter 18 today, and starting right out in verse 1, we hear that after this, Paul left Athens, and we won't go through all that we talked about last week, but he left Athens and went to Corinth. And I think we have a map of that area just so you can get an idea. Sometimes we throw out all these city names and then, where is that? I don't know. But Corinth is on that little spot there that sort of connects. And in this time, they were calling that Achaia. We think of it as Greece, and it was Greece before that. But anyway, so Paul went there. And Corinth, at this time, it was a city in the Roman Empire, and historians, everyone says, there was no city more corrupt in the whole Roman Empire than Corinth. They were morally corrupt, they were dishonest, they were just, everything that they did was about their own pleasure. They had about 1,000 temple prostitutes there that they that was a big thing there. And they it was a place that for Paul to go in, I know he said when he saw all those statues and idols there in Athens that he was just troubled by that, but I'm sure he was troubled here as well. It doesn't say it here, but it had to be a big job when he thought about, how am I going to share the gospel with these people? And it was a time really of there was starting to be some persecution again of the Jews, and we'll read that rather than me tell you. So verse 2 says, he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. There are many times like that throughout history, focused on the nation of Israel. Sometimes it was based on jealousy. Sometimes it was based on their religion was different. You know, the Romans had all those many gods, and the Jews said one God. And anyway, so these people were in Corinth and really ended up befriending Paul and becoming partners in his ministry. This verse continues, he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now, the synagogue, remember, was a place where the Jewish people met to worship. He always tried to start there, and we've been seeing sometimes people were receptive, sometimes they were receptive for a little while, and then not so much after they saw many people coming to Jesus. But there were also people there who were not Jewish, who were people just seeking God, who hadn't converted to Judaism. And that's what this verse means about Greeks. There are people who weren't, from the nation of Israel. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. When we see that in Scripture, sometimes we'll see it like Jesus Christ. Here it says the Christ was Jesus, so it's clearer. But that word Christos means Messiah. So what he was telling the Jews is that your Messiah that you've been expecting came, Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own hands. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Now, that doesn't mean he never ministered to the Jews again. It just means in that city, he no longer focused on going to the synagogue and trying to help the Jewish people see. And that shaking out your garments or shaking the dust off your feet, all those were sort of ways that they had of saying, I'm done with this. I'm just, that's enough. And you can see if if today when we were sharing the word, or Sherry was doing prayer requests, or we were singing, if you stood up and argued and said, I don't like the words to that song, or whatever, well, that's the kind of thing these people were doing. They were opposing Paul publicly, right to his face, when he was trying to teach them about Jesus. And you can see why after a bit he decided, this isn't really going to work. Also, it really was the Jewish people in those other cities that we've been looking at that ended up beating him with rods and getting him arrested and all those things. And even though we know the Apostle Paul was a great man of faith, after a while that would have gotten old, don't you think? Everywhere you go, these people are just not happy and causing you trouble. Well, he left there and went to the house of a man, meaning left the synagogue, no longer teaching there, went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue, so his new place to teach was right next door to the synagogue. And Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord. So that means while Paul was ministering in the synagogue, Crispus, who would have been the head elder, the person who sort of organized things and made sure everything happened, this guy, Crispus, had already believed in Jesus as Lord, and together with his entire household, which was very much more common in those days, that households kind of stuck together, that Crispus, the father of his household, would have either brought his family with him to hear Paul or went home and said, I've heard this new teaching and I just realized that we've been waiting all this time and the Messiah has come. And they believed their dad when he told them, and they believed in Jesus as Lord. So many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. I was thinking of that when this week I was hearing about the revival in Asbury, and just thinking about how much unhappiness, how much discord, how much protest. It seems like no one is very happy in our nation, and especially not our young people. And to see a group of people, not that you want to just, watch people and see what they're doing, but just to see young people so worshiping God and not doing all those other things that we often think of young people in college doing, it really was, it was assuring to me, God is not limited by things that we think, oh, we're never going to get over this. I don't know how we'll ever fix this. Well, Jesus knew that Paul was getting discouraged, even though Paul didn't say, I'm discouraged, I need help, I've had it with these Jewish people, I'm trying to tell about the gospel. Jesus knew that. In verse 9, the Lord said to Paul one night in a vision, do not be afraid, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. Now, Paul could have easily said, well, you weren't there with me when they were beating me with rods, but he didn't. He recognized, that there sometimes was going to be suffering, and that God was with him, but didn't stop the beating. But here, Jesus is actually promising Paul, because he's just feeling like, wow, it just seems like an awful lot of pushback about this. He's telling Paul that he wants him to continue even though it's hard. And often we do get discouraged when things don't seem to be going quite right, when we just think God isn't blessing us quite like we thought he would and hasn't made everything easy. I think it's important for us to realize that even Paul had a time where Jesus came to him in this vision, and that's okay. Jesus knows you and I and knows what it is that we need, and there's a special nearness to those who are faithful to the Lord, to people who are faithful through hard stuff, faithful through suffering, who don't just fall away and say, oh, that's not working, and, stop thinking about God, stop praying, stop that sort of thing. Many people do that. I'm not making a big deal like that's terrible, but there's a special nearness that comes when going through something that kind of would make sense. It's humanly very difficult, and all the things that Paul had gone through. And I just encourage you that if you are going through tough stuff right now, the benefit, the good outcome of staying faithful to God, not walking away or getting discouraged, but staying faithful to God, brings you closer and helps you know better who Jesus is. When Moses was afraid, remember, to return to Egypt, he had killed an Egyptian and run away, buried the guy, and everything he did, it was, a crime. And he'd left Egypt. He had been a prince there in the palace and left and went to the desert and was there for 40 years. He had a family there. He was a shepherd there. He had work there. He met God there. But he was afraid when God said, I'm going to use you to deliver the nation of Israel. He was afraid to go back. He was afraid of what might happen. He was afraid of how he would be received. He might have been afraid of being tried for his crimes. It's just hard to know what all he was afraid of. But God used that same statement. He said, I will be with you. He said, Moses, I will be with you. Now, Moses didn't exactly say, oh, good, that's enough. He said, but I have trouble speaking. I have trouble public speaking. And I know that court of Pharaoh is just really harsh, and they want everything to be just right, or they make fun of people. And he wasn't really trusting God all the way. And God still said, okay, your brother Aaron can go with you. He's a speaker. He's not going to be afraid. And that is how it worked. And when Joshua, after Moses was no longer leader of Israel, Joshua came and he was afraid. He was facing all kinds of trouble. The children of Israel had kind of gotten less than committed to their relationship with God while they were in the desert. They were ready to go into the promised land, and Joshua was afraid. And again, that same statement, God said, I will be with you. I will not leave you. I won't forsake you. And even when things are not going just as we want them to, God does not leave us or forsake us. He is with us through those things. So Paul took this answer and was encouraged by it, and he stayed 1 year and 6 months, 18 months, teaching the word of God among them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. Now, he was probably thinking, okay, here it goes. Jesus told me he was going to protect me, but it looks like 18 months was the limit on that. And they were saying, this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. And when Paul was about to open his mouth, so he was going to try to give a defense of what he was doing, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things. Now that seems kind of like a not answer, but really that's an amazing answer, because what he was saying is, I won't try Paul for this argument you have with him. He listened and said, sounds like he's still as Jewish as you are, and really Paul was. He's just saying your Messiah has come and you're saying he hasn't. And that's not something you bring to the court. You guys settle that on your own. And because of that, there was this little kind of peaceful time where Christianity was considered to be a sect, let's say, of Judaism. and they were protected because that was an official religion. It was okay to do that. You could not start up a new religion under Rome. It had to be sanctioned by the Romans. But it gave Paul and all those who were ministering to people in the Roman Empire, gave them almost as though they were, don't bother them. They had a precedent that they're Jewish, leave them alone. And so he drove them from the tribunal. That was Gallio, the guy in charge. And they all seized Sosthenes, the ruler. It doesn't say it, but he's the new ruler of the synagogue. Crispus, remember, had become a Christian, and I guess they thought he couldn't rule the synagogue anymore. Or maybe his time was just up, I don't know. But Sosthenes, they seized him and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of this. He just decided, I'm going to let these people work out their own problems. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. Now this couple, they apparently were well-to-do, and you'll find them again and again through the New Testament. I think it's 6 times or something like that they're mentioned. And they are key to Paul's ministry. They have at one point, they have a church in their own home, and they're people who are just committed to God, and Paul was blessed by them. At Cenchrea, he had cut his hair. This is Paul again, for he was under a vow. Sometimes I wonder, what are we supposed to know about that? I've even thought of just leaving out little verses like that, but I feel like they're all important. A vow would have been something like a Nazirite vow, where Paul would have, to be closer to God or to pray about something really important, would have allowed his hair to grow and fallen under a whole bunch of restrictions, like not eating any grapes or drinking any alcohol. There were a number of things. And they would make a vow. This was a Jewish vow, and they would make it for a period of time. And apparently he had been just seriously praying that whole time. And they say, but Paul got a haircut. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. So you see, again, he hasn't held it against all Jews everywhere. He hasn't said, well, I'm never going to the synagogue again. You just can't trust these folks to listen to what I have to say and to realize it's true and it's good for them. He went right into the synagogue in Ephesus, and when they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills, and he set sail from Ephesus. Now, God actually did allow Paul to return to Ephesus, and he did a great work there. And there's a letter in your New Testament, the letter to the Ephesians, and we see the church in Ephesus is mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so it sounds like they kind of got shorted, but he did go back. It was God's will that he went there. He just not right then. As we look at the life of Paul, I think the key thing out of this spot that we've looked at today is that Jesus is near to us too. When we know him, when we have made him Lord of our lives, he's with us at all times. But honestly, there are some times when people pray and they just feel like, I don't know, I just feel like God is kind of distant, like he's not really paying attention to what I say, and bad things are happening to me, and I wonder, is he there? Does he know? And we're assured by Scripture that yes, he is with us. He's close with us. He never leaves us. He never forsakes us. He repeated that to key people in the Bible with great faith, people I mentioned, like Moses and Joshua and Paul. And all of us have times like that. It's okay to say, God, I just could use a little assurance right now. I just feel like I know that you are who you say you are, but I'm just feeling a little rattled. It's okay to pray that and say, please, God, remind me that you are with me. But also don't forget that really, if we go through hard things, not getting them just miracled and fixed and everything okay by God, but we go through hard times, trusting God anyway, there's really nothing that draws us closer to Him than that. And that's a reward in and of itself. If we all had easy, fun lives and never had any need, we would not be as close to Jesus as when we draw near to Him in trouble. As we close today, I know we have potluck and we have things planned, but just take a little time, really, and focus on Jesus. I'm so impressed with those college students who had tests and papers and girls and boys to meet and all the fun things they wanted to do, ending their chapel service at the altar and staying. They stayed because the presence of the Lord was there. And sometimes we are really shortchanged when we let our own schedule, our own busy stuff, important stuff, things you have to do, when we let those things just dictate how much time we have. And I just think that God knows, He always knows how much time you have. He knows how many things you have to do. He also knows when you really, really want to press in and know Him more. And I just encourage you as we close today to spend some time talking with Jesus.